Okay, welcome back. Mr. Garside, if you would be so kind as to present our 5-year forecast.
Madam President, members of the board, as required by law, it's that time of year again to present the 5-year forecast for the fiscal 2017-18 school year. As you know, the 5-year forecast is required to be approved by the Board of Education each year in October and May. And this particular forecast covers fiscal year 2018 through fiscal year 2022. It seems like 2022, that just is kind of blowing me away, but this one goes out to fiscal year 2022. I'll have 5 topics that I want to discuss in a little bit more detail tonight. I'm going to talk about the overall revenues, expenditures, and cash balances. Next, I will talk about reappraisal and some of the effects that will have on our school district. After that, I'll talk about state funding. After that, expenditure highlights, and then I'll finish up with something I share most meetings when I do this is a county comparison in Franklin County, where we stand with our property taxes and also our expenditure per pupil. So the first graph I'd like to talk about is our overall revenues, expenditures, and cash balances. The revenues are in the blue, represented by blue, expenditures represented by red, and cash balance represented by green. Our forecast has improved since last May, and 2 of the main reasons are we have a projected increase in our property values due to reappraisal. That had a nice little bump in our property taxes that I'll talk in more detail in a minute. But also the biggest factor was our approved state budget that went into effect July 1 of this current fiscal year, July 1, 2017. We had a 5.5% increase for this fiscal year and a 5.8% increase for the following fiscal year. So it represents roughly 60% of our revenues. So when you're talking about a 5.5% and a 5.8% increase, it has a significant increase in your bottom line. One of the important things when we're looking at the green bars there for our cash balance, what's important to note about that is we've talked a lot about targeting our cash balance to be somewhere between 3 to 6 months of operating expenditures. Currently, this forecast has a 6 to 8 month cash balance throughout fiscal year 2022, so we're really in strong shape. And what's important about the targeted cash balance of 3 to 6 months, it's considered a best practice by organizations such as the Government Finance Officers Association. So when we're sitting in front of a rating and presentation talking to Standard & Poor's and Moody's, we're trying to get good interest rates when we're out issuing debt. These are things that they're looking for to show that we're in a strong financial position. So I just wanted to highlight that our cash balance is a strong cash balance for the entirety of the forecast, somewhere between 6 to 8 months in each of the fiscal years. The next slide, this is going to be a little harder to see. I did provide you a copy in color at your station there, so you can check that out. But what I'd like to go over here is this gives us 8 years of our assessed values, starting in tax year 2010 right here, going into tax year 2017. As you hopefully know, taxes are collected in arrears, meaning when you go to the county auditor and they're talking about tax years and collection years, so this current one we're going to be in is tax year 17. They're reappraising our values for tax year 17, and then they're going to send you a bill for 2017 and 2018. So if you've ever sold a house like on January 10th or something like that, you know that you owe that whole tax bill from 2017 because you lived in that house in 2017. That's kind of how that works. So taxes are you're always a year behind. And usually people realize that when maybe they sell their house and they realize, I already paid my taxes, why am I paying them again? It's because everything's a year behind. So looking a little bit more detail of this, our last reappraisal was in this second column there. That was in tax year 2011. At that time, our tax values decreased by about 8%. As you remember, when we had the financial market crash, home values really took a hit. And at that time, our values decreased. But one thing that I've talked about a lot here and in the prior forecasts is there's something called House Bill 920, which readjusts millage rates as values go up, a millage rate will go down to basically collect the same amount of money. The same thing happens when values increase. The millage rate will decrease slightly to collect roughly the same amount. So, in that fiscal year right there, or that tax year right there, when it decreased by 8%, our taxes didn't go down by 8%. They did go down because there's another thing that factors in. We have 3.85 inside mills, and those mills are mills that never change. So as values go up or down, that will affect your taxes. At that time, our tax revenue went down by about $1.4 million that tax year. Reason being, the 3.85 inside mills, and also we had a levy that we passed in 2009, which was our last operating levy, of 7.4 mills. That was being collected at the full rate because values were pretty stagnant and it never raised up, or never lowered at any time. So that decrease in 8% of value hit that specific levy and decreased our revenue also. Many people don't know that it's not just an overall tax rate that they give you. They look at every single levy that we've ever passed and calculate those individually to make sure you're only collecting the approved amount for that specific levy. The inverse is happening this year. We have a large increase that's estimated by the Franklin County Auditor. Currently, it's estimated about 14.6%. You realize, a lot of you homeowners probably realize you've gotten notices in the mail that saying, hey, this is your new appraised value. If you want to argue that appraised value, feel free to come to these certain meetings that the county auditor is putting on, and you can argue that if you think it's going up too much. So I'm not sure what that final amount will land, and we'll know more about that roughly in November. But currently it's 14.6%. But there's a factor that goes into that too. It's called equalization. The real purpose of reappraisal is to make sure each property owner is paying their fair share. So if our overall value goes up by 14.6%, some people's value might go up by 30%. Now, those people that went up higher than the average, their taxes will go up because they're going to pay a little bit more of the share of the overall tax bill for the school district. Now, there's also people out there that their property value didn't go up 14.6%. Maybe it went up 8%. Those people's tax bills will decrease. So it kind of works both ways on that with reappraisal. Again, I mentioned this earlier, the 3.85 mil inside millage doesn't change. So as that value increases, we will get about $1.2 million. We should get about $1.2 million additional tax revenue, and half of that will be collected in the last half of fiscal year 18, meaning you owe a tax bill in January of 2018, so that's half of fiscal year 18, and then the rest of it will be the first half of fiscal year 19. So it's kind of split up, that $600,000 in this fiscal year and $600,000 in the next fiscal year. There's also something I want to point out when people get their tax bill that they need to know about. There was a overall 1.75 senior levy. 1.3 mils of that was already just a renewal, is paying the same amount you paid before, but there was a 0.45 mil increase. So your tax, everybody in the county's tax bill is going to go up due to that Franklin County senior levy that's on the docket. Any questions on reappraisal and kind of how that all works? I just think it's interesting to see that, our values, the red is class 1 property, which is residential and agricultural. The green is commercial and industrial. And it doesn't really show, but that purple line down there is public utility, personal property, power lines. There's a new substation going on out over by Central Crossing. So those are taxed at the full tax rate. So every dollar of value that grows, we get additional dollars that's paid for by the utility companies. And that has been you can't tell that it's growing, but it has grown pretty significantly over the last several years. So that's another little cushion that we have in our tax revenues. Next slide I want to talk about is state funding. Before we really look at this slide in detail, I mentioned earlier when I started my presentation that we have a 5.5% increase budgeted for this fiscal year, and another 5.8% increase budgeted for next fiscal year. And I also mentioned that roughly 60% of our revenues comes from the state of Ohio. I'm just going to talk about it in really broad terms. There's a state funding formula. State aid is calculated on a per pupil basis, roughly. I did bring a copy of the. This is the formula. It's double-sided and pretty small print, so you can see that. It has about 1 million lines of calculations, and they weight students by economically disadvantaged, or they weighted them by special ed services they get, ESL services they get, different categorical funding. But the basic premise of school funding is that you have X number of students and they give you X dollars for every student. So that creates a calculated funding amount. And districts can fall into one of three categories. They can either be a formula district, meaning when you put the number of students and the dollars that go into this formula, they are receiving exactly what this formula calculates. That's a formula district. There's not many of those in the state of Ohio. There's another type of district called a guarantee district. Guarantee districts are generally districts that are kind of declining in enrollment. They may have some other factors that are causing their formula to actually go down from what it was calculated the previous year. So a guarantee district actually will receive whatever they received in fiscal 17, they'll get in fiscal 18. They're just guaranteed what they received before. And the purpose for that is it's hard to penalize a district for if they lose some students. They still have a lot of the same staff. Sometimes they can't just take several staff members off their books. They still need the same staff to educate a fewer amount of students. So the state, and this has happened for a long time, they use these guarantees to help smooth out budgets for school districts throughout the state. So there's quite a few of those guarantee districts. There's another type of district called a cap district. That's what we are. A cap district is a district that when they put the money, or they put all the money and the students in the formula, and they look at it statewide, they say, wow, we really can't afford to pay that much in state funding. We have a finite budget. We can only allocate so much to school districts throughout the state of Ohio. So we're going to have to put a cap on this so we can actually afford paying these off. So what that means to our school district, that's why I wanted to give you this little scenario here on this slide. So we are a cap district, meaning that we're not, once our numbers are put into the calculation, it provides this calculated amount here. So this is our total state aid, and this is our calculated funding. You can see when it goes into the formula, the total calculation is $145.6 million. What we actually receive is $133.9 million, creating a difference of $11.6 million. That's what we would receive if the formula was fully funded. We'd receive $11.6 million more in our bank accounts. And you think about that's a lot of money. I think anybody can agree with that. But to think of it in a different way, currently the state amount per pupil is $6,010. If you divide the reduction due to the cap, we are so far into the cap that we'd have to lose 1,900 students to get into the formula. That's a lot of students. So what I'm trying to portray there is that we're very protected. That means I'm very confident that we'll receive the total state funding that they've allocated for us, because it would take a very large number of students leaving our school district to affect the cap. And as you may know, we've actually increased by 435 students this year. So I don't think we're going to be reducing any students. We're at a total student enrollment our first week in October of 22,082 students. So we're continuing to see increases. We've seen increases the last, for several years. We've seen pretty significant increases in enrollment. So I feel pretty confident that the numbers that I've put into the forecast will ring true. That's just a comfort factor that I think is important to note. Now, I don't have this on a slide, but I'd just like to go over a few years in history. And this year, I told you we're $11.6 million into the cap, meaning we would receive that additional dollar amount. For fiscal year 17, it was $9.3 million. For fiscal year 16, it was $13.2 million. For For fiscal year 15, it was 10.1 million, and for fiscal year 14, it was 14.1 million. So you're starting to add up to some real dollars that has been taken. You know, the state says you deserve this, but we can't afford it. And there has been a push in school districts throughout. A lot of Central Ohio school districts are on the cap. There has been some discussion of how do we get some gains on that cap? How do we get the cap removed? It's really a situation where there's only so many dollars to go around. So I'm not super confident that that will ever get any traction, but it has been addressed at the state of Ohio with the legislature, and hopefully it's something that could ease in the future. Another thing I want to point out about state funding is that we do have a large amount of students that go to community schools, roughly 1,900 students that are on our books right now that go to community schools, and the annual deduction is $14.3 million currently. That's what's going out. So if you think about this cap funding situation that we're in, if we receive another student, we don't get additional dollars. But the way community schools are funded, if one of our students leave, I told you we're 1,900 students into the cap. If a student leaves, we're still going to receive the same amount of state funding, but that's $6,000, and usually plus, because they're usually have some economic disadvantages or some special ed categorical aid that goes with them. That $6,000 goes out the door. So we lose that $6,000 every time a student leaves to a community school. And just for a little bit more information, I know there's been a lot of rhetoric and talk in the newspaper about ECOT, Electronic Classroom of Tomorrow, and their $60 million that they owe the state of Ohio and school districts. We currently have roughly 380 students, and our deduction is $2.7 million that goes to ECOT. Now, if they're going to pay back school districts, that's still yet to be seen. It wouldn't be the whole $2.7 million, but I'm sure there are some students of that 380 students that may be in that lawsuit. So I don't have any details on that, but I just wanted to give you kind of a feel of where the district stands as far as how community schools are funded and how it affects our state aid. How it really doesn't affect our state aid, it just affects our expenditures. Next, I want to give a few highlights on expenditures. Personnel services, which is all our contractual agreements with our unions, and also employee benefits. If you add both of those together, it represents roughly 80% of our operating budget. That seems like a lot, but that's very common in school districts. We're in the people business, and the staffing it takes to run a efficient and also a first-class educational operation. This is usually where you are, around 80%. We have agreements that last through 2019 with two of our groups, SWIA and SWA, and OPSI is out one more year beyond them. So when doing the forecast, I use those actual numbers to put those figures in there to calculate what I'm projecting for salary and benefits. Also, there's a kind of a question mark out there as far as employee benefits go, and I just put up there the Affordable Care Act repeal and replacement. The reason I wanted to highlight that again, I've talked about this in previous forecasts. We have a $2 million Cadillac tax that's kind of looming out there right now in 2020 that is still in law. So in 2020, it's possible that we are hit with a Cadillac tax of roughly $2 million, and that's probably that could be a little bit on the low side. But that $2 million is something that we'll need to kind of keep on the radar. It's currently in the forecast. I want to make sure that we're safeguarded if that does happen, so it is in this forecast. You need to be aware of that. But as these things start to materialize from the federal level, if you start hearing about Affordable Care Act and what things that they're thinking about changing, subsidies, there's just a lot of things out there that they're talking about. Currently the Cadillac tax is still in place. Other expenditures, you remember last year the win-win agreement was amended, and we have in the past paid $1.2 million a year to safeguard our property tax value that City of Columbus City Schools can't go after those property values. That is off the table now. It's going to be reduced by 20% over the next 5 years until the payment is down to nothing. So we'll save roughly $231,000 per year on that payment, and that starts this fiscal year. They have promised in writing that they won't go after, that the boundaries are set where they are. There won't be any shifting of students or shifting of property values, and this is just an agreement that we have with the Columbus City Schools that we will fulfill. Any questions on expenditure levels? Last but not least, it's a little hard to see up there as well, but our Franklin County comparisons, they really haven't changed a whole lot. This is for tax year 2016, collection year 2017. So you've paid these tax rates. So where we are as a school district, if you look at this column here, that is all of our levies. That's every school district and 16 school districts in Franklin County, and that would include all property taxes that they levy against their property owners. That would be if you have a improvement levy, if you have a bond issue that you pass to build buildings, your operating levies. Altogether, that's where that amount comes from. And we're currently 12th out of 16 school districts. We have done a lot of building in the last several years. Our last building project in 2012 was a no new millage, so that's why we still remain to be pretty low in our property tax overall millage rate. When you look at our operating taxes, our last operating levy was passed in 2009. I'm glad to say that our forecast doesn't show that we're really have anything on the horizon for operating levies. And we promised our community in 2009 that we'd stay off the ballot till 2013, and we're going to far exceed that. But they're also, what it shows here is we're 14th out of 16 school districts in the county. Now, the final column to the right, that is our per pupil expenditure. This comes from the 2015-16 local report card from the state of Ohio. If you look at that, we spend currently, we're spending 13th out of 16 school districts what we're spending per pupil, and it's actually $710 less than the state average. The state average in Ohio was $10,984 in 2015-16, and our expenditure per pupil was $10,274, so it's $710 lower than the state average. So I think with this, what I like to portray when I present this information is that our taxpayers are getting a good bang for their buck. We continue to excel in education, in the education arena, and we're doing it at a very efficient and affordable price. And I think that's something to take note of, and something that we can be proud of as a school district and a board. So that's my 5-year forecast. If you have any questions, I would entertain those right now.
A comment, keep us posted on what we can do to help with that cap situation, because in nowhere can it be deemed fair that we pay completely out of local funds to educate in excess of 1,900 of our students. So something needs to be done with the caps.